church grounded in polity. Well, what is polity? Polity is the political structure and organization of anything. It's the political structure and organization. And I put a sort of a little thing underneath how an organization does business. I think it's a little bit easier to understand than the fancy word polity. Nonetheless, we in the church use that to be fancy, probably. Moving forward, before we get into the specifics of polity, I'd like to review a little bit of church history, because that's very pertinent to how we do business evolved. And as you know, in the early days at Pentecost, when the church began, there was the note that Peter was going to be the head, and somehow the church moved on and continued to function. There was times of persecution, but eventually there became a union, and the church was recognized as a body, and the faith was recognized in the culture and in society. And it was a time when the leadership of Peter came to the fore in the form of popes. And the church was unified as a single church. That went on till 1054. And 1054 was significant because that was the original split in the Christian community. And it split off east and west. Sounds like a north. Somehow things don't split north and south. So it's always east and west. And in the east, the Orthodox churches, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, eventually they all split themselves up. But originally the Orthodox Church remained as a single place, and their headquarters was Constantinople, is where the Eastern Church had its headquarters. The Western Church, of course, moved as the headquarters in Rome. And the Pope was in Rome. In the East, they didn't call him the Pope, but there was the Archbishop and the head of the church. As we move forward, obviously very shortly there, I shouldn't say shortly, probably about 300-400 years, I think it was in the 1500s, that Martin Luther issued his theses, and the church began to change, and there were become split-offs from the Western church. And also the other key one is the one that affects us is Thomas Cranmer in the English church and Henry VIII. And we can see what evolved from there. A variety of Protestant denominations, your Reformed Church from Calvin, John Knox, the Presbyterians, Zwingli, the Anabaptists and Mennonites, Martin Luther, of course, the Lutherans. And from out of the English part of this came the Puritans, Separatists, ultimately Congregationalists, Church of Christ, Seventh-day Adventists, and of course, most importantly, out of the English church came the Methodists, and eventually the Pentecostals. Roman Catholics split up a little bit, but not really. They've maintained their unity. So that gives you a picture of what went on in the church in terms of bodies that stayed together. Then the question is, well, how did they function? Well, before the Reformation, it was all Episcopal Polity. And that was based on holy orders. That was based on the succession of Peter. And generally the orders of the leadership in the church were the bishops, the priests, and the deacons. They were ordained by the bishop And the bishops, of course, were ordained by other bishops, but then the priests and the deacons were also ordained. And within the context of the church, they had two functions. They functioned in a sacramental and religious aspect. They conducted the worship, and they had some key roles in certainly some of the worship. Certainly in terms of creating holy orders and that kind of thing. But they also were the celebrators of the Eucharist, was a priestly function. They baptized. They married. They buried. In other words, those functions were done by those people in holy orders. Also, there was governance. Somehow they managed themselves. And in this instance, in the early days, it was all up to the bishop. Bishop said, "You go here," you saluted and went there, and so forth. So that was how it was before the Reformation. When it split off Eastern and Western churches, it remained the same in both the Eastern and Western parts of the church. But with the coming of the Reformation, we began to get some new kinds of polity. And we continued with Episcopal polity, those churches that used a bishop and so forth, the holy orders, as part of their structure. There was congregational polity, and there was Presbyterian polity. So all of those various branches of the Reformation ultimately began to operate differently. They certainly didn't want the Pope anymore, and that was part of the whole function of the Reformation. But effectively, three different strands of polity began to develop: Episcopal, Congregational, and Presbyterian. But let's get a little bit more detailed here. The Congregational polity practiced in the Baptist, Quakers, Congregational, and perhaps most importantly, independent churches. The Outer Banks is filled with independent churches. And effectively, they're not associated with anybody or anything except that congregation. And Congregationalist polity is known as Congregationalism. It's a system of ecclesiastical church polity in which every local church congregation is independent, ecclesiastically sovereign or autonomous, and its first articulation in writing is what's called the Cambridge Platform in 1648. Now, what's interesting about this is that, for instance, the Southern Baptists have an association, and they sort of look like they might be Episcopalians or Lutherans and so forth, but they're not, because they are a congregational church. They're a church in which every local congregation is independent, ecclesiastically sovereign, and autonomous, even though it looks like they have some organization. And actually, I think some of the more progressive of the Baptist churches look a little bit more like the other Protestant denominations. So for instance, the American Baptists generally have a very high degree of education. They generally have the same kind of standards for education that we have in the Episcopal Church or the Lutheran Church, whereas some of them don't have a standard for education. So somebody off the street can say, "Hey, I'm called, make me the pastor." He gets everybody in the congregation to vote. He's the pastor, or she's the pastor. But that's how it works. Certainly significantly different than our polity. So that's congregational polity. Next one is Presbyterian or presbyteral polity. It's a method of church government, again, ecclesiastical polity, typified by the rule of assemblies or presbyters or elders. In other words, within each congregation, they elect people to be the session, which is like our vestry, or the consistory, church board. Groups of local churches are governed by a higher assembly known as the presbytery. In other words, when we have like diocesan convention, they have a presbytery. And what's interesting is, and they all again go to national and sometimes international kinds of bodies. But the responsibility for the conduct of service is reserved to an ordained minister or pastor known as a teaching elder, or the minister of word and sacrament. So they don't ordain, but nonetheless they have standards, and they designate who is allowed to be the teaching elder or the minister of the sacraments. So that's generally found in the Presbyterian churches, of course, but also Reformed churches too use this form of government. Moving on to Episcopal polity, and we're going to say more about that because, of course, the Roman Catholics use it, Orthodox denominations use it, the Methodists use it, and we as Episcopalians or Anglicans use it also. A little bit about Episcopal polity. It's a hierarchical form of church government. The local authority is the bishop. It's, as I said earlier, used by many Christian churches, Catholics, Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, Orthodox Church of the East, the Anglicans, and Lutheran churches. Churches with Episcopal polity are governed by bishops who practice their authority in dioceses generally, but sometimes conferences like in the Methodist Church, they have their annual conference, and that's run by the bishop. Bishop supervises clergy, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that. Bishops are considered, as I said earlier, to derive their authority from the unbroken apostolic succession of the 12 apostles of Jesus. They are said to represent the historic episcopate. In other words, begun with Peter, I'm part of that, Cindy is part of that, and that moves forward. It's the way we approach our polity is through holy orders, bishops, priests, and deacons. To be a little bit more specific is that there are some differences in how Episcopal polity works itself out. Their leadership in a lot of churches is sacramental and constitutional. They perform ordinations, confirmations, and consecrations. But if you'll notice, in the Roman Catholic Church, for instance, the Pope is the head bishop, and he's the leader, and he's also the chief operating officer. He controls both the sacramental, the religious part of it, and the administrative elements of the church. Now, obviously, he has a lot of bureaucrats floating around to help him do that, but in the end, when a bishop is appointed, he's appointed by the Pope. And it is a he still. Local diocesan bishops do the same thing. They have control over their diocese. And they control where the clergy go or whether they stay. And they actually have some very interesting problems these days because there are really not enough priests. However, the church is shrinking also, so it's a real challenge. When I go back to northeastern Pennsylvania, for instance, there was a Catholic high school in every town. There are 2 Catholic high schools in all of northeastern Pennsylvania now. The number of churches in a town, in the first church I was in was Freeland, Pennsylvania, and there were, 1, 2, 3, 4, I think there were 5 Roman Catholic churches. Only 1 left. It's really a shrinking environment. We don't realize that so much down here, but it is. They have some incredible challenges. And they've done some very interesting things in terms of polity, because there's churches sometimes don't even have a pastor. All they have is a supply priest who comes on Sunday. And they've sort of developed lay leaders who kind of manage the congregation during the week. And they're called different things in different places. But it's fascinating to see how the Romans have dealt with some incredible personnel challenges. Let's go over to the Methodists. The Methodists have bishops who actually, to some degree, their bishops are more powerful than the Episcopal bishops, because they literally have the power to move people around. And if you've ever been involved with people in the Methodist Church, you'll know that everybody's worried about when the conference is going to come up, because that's usually when they change seats. Musical chairs takes place, and the bishop announces it and control. I think they're a little more democratic process these days than there used to be. But in the end, the bishop in the Methodist Church is the boss of deployment and is in charge of the general how they work. Episcopal bishops are this mishmash of things. First of all, they're elected by a diocese. They're not appointed by anybody; they are elected, and they lead the sacramental elements within the diocese. Certainly, they ordain priests, they confirm people, and they do that. However, and they generally at the General Convention, we'll talk a little bit more about how the Episcopal Church operates, but they generally are the presiding officer at the conventions. But the fact is, in terms of personnel management, they have to do that in conjunction with parishes. So the bishop couldn't say, listen, I want Joe Schmo to come down here. The diocese worked with All Saints Church, with the calling committee, with the various back and forth, and what seemed like a long and tedious process, but it worked out very well. We got Cindy, and but that all came as a result of a process in which the bishop was involved, but the bishop was not in control of. It was a democratic and a collegial form of development of the governance of the church. So, moving on. Episcopal polity is particularly described in what we call the Constitution and canons, along with the rules of order of the Episcopal Church, the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America. And these rules and regulations, Constitution, all of these kinds of things, are found in a book that's about 200 pages long, as it was described in there. And it deals with a lot of different things. First of all, the General Convention. General Convention in the Episcopal Church meets every 3 years. It's called the Triennial Convention. And it's, again, a very different kind. It has two houses. It has a House of Bishops and a House of Deputies. The deputies are a combination of lay people and clergy people who are elected by dioceses to attend that convention. It also has a body that works from convention to convention, the executive committee. And as a matter of fact, our own test judge, I'm not sure if she's still on it, but she was on it for many years. She's a real player in our national church. I'm not sure a lot of people are familiar with that or realize that, but she is part of the executive committee. I share this with you, not that you need to memorize it, and it's not that as clear as I wish it would be, but it gives you some idea what it deals with. And if you'll notice, it deals primarily with how we function. But the other thing is, if you'll look at item 10, the Book of Common Prayer. And that's really important. And as Bob went through the prayer book is really, in some sense, our principal document. Because it does that. You remember there were two sides. There was the sacramental side and the governance side. This is the governance side, but the governance side still has a lot to do with the Book of Common Prayer, because the General Convention decides what's going to be in the Book of Common Prayer, and is the one who basically, shall we say, licenses it. Just some more that you see in the Constitution and Canons, and the second title is on worship, the ordination of bishops. I should say the celebration of Sundays, the translations of the Bible. A lot of people think, well, we can read whatever we want in church. If we follow the rules, there are only certain pieces or translations of Scripture that are authorized by our General Convention, and you may wonder, well, why is that? What's wrong with translations that sound really good and so forth? Well, part of the problem is that oftentimes those translations are individual translations. In other words, Joe Schmo said, I think I'll translate the Bible. That's not to say that Joe Schmo's translation isn't good. But we as an Episcopal Church see the need for it to be more Catholic, shall we say. And when I say Catholic, I mean universal. And therefore, all of the translations of the Bible that are authorized to be read in the church are ones that are done by large groups of collegial efforts to translate from the original Greek, the original Hebrew, and whatever languages they can find to basically get as good a translation as you possibly can. And it's done by a group. And the main reason for that is that basically, obviously, an individual has his or her own subjective values about what a Greek word means. Now, that's not to say that that's wrong, but it is to say it's not leavened by a broader picture. And we as Episcopalians believe we need what I would call Catholicity. It needs a broader view than simply what the individual translator says. And there's a number of others, the reception of clergy, diocese without bishop, and then there's a number of pages on ecclesiastical discipline, which we will not get into. And there's some other things there. But that's the outline of what we as an Episcopal Church work off of. These are our rules, these are our laws, and this is how we do business. This brings us to a portion of them that talk about regulations respecting the laity, an Episcopal parish. And the point is, who belongs? Well, baptized persons belong. All persons who have received the sacrament of holy baptism with water in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, whether in this church or another Christian church. In other words, if you're baptized, you're baptized. No matter what denomination, if you believe, if it is believed that you were baptized, you're baptized. Those members who can be adult members when you become 16. That's the age of adulthood in terms of the Episcopal Church. Now, the other thing is that I know we're working on this with some of you guys, is that confirmation is expected. It's not mandatory, but if in fact, as you'll see shortly, if in fact you want to be a part of the vestry or some of the leadership of the church, you really do need to be confirmed. But it's not mandatory for you to be a member. In other words, everybody who's baptized is a member, and confirmed are members too, but that's a higher level. As it says there, it's expected that all adult members of this church, after appropriate instruction, will have made a mature public affirmation of their faith and commitment to the responsibilities of baptism, and will have been confirmed or received by the laying on of hands of bishop or a bishop of the church in full communion with this church. So that's who belongs to the Episcopal Church. If you're baptized, you're in. And therefore, for instance, you're entitled to all the rights and privileges. You can come to the sacrament. A lot of people have some concern, well, should kids receive the sacrament? If they're baptized, they are welcome to receive the sacrament. This was a large concern over the years. And before the prayer book in 79, by and large, first of all, baptism did not play as key a role as it does now. Oftentimes, baptisms were private ceremonies. But if you look at the Book of Common Prayer in 1979, baptism was very much a Sunday worship item. And the receiving of communion was for everyone. And so things changed significantly with the institution of the prayer book in 1979. Again, that's the prayer book often is the key point, because our focus is worship. Our focus is not theology. In other words, we don't ask in terms of your membership, you don't have to believe this, that, or the other thing. It doesn't say anything about that to be members. You have to be baptized to be a member. The other thing is if you want to be a communicant or a person in good standing, there are also some rules about that. Those who are communicants, all members of the church who have received Holy Communion in this church at least 3 times during a year are considered communicants of this church. And so, for the purpose of statistical consistency throughout the church, communicants 16 years of age or over are to be considered adult communicants. I would say that there's a fair amount of confusion in this because of it used to be that this really focused on confirmation. And effectively now, confirmation focuses a little bit more on if you would like to be part of the leadership. The leadership requires a little bit higher level of commitment, is really what it amounts to. And that's the expectation in our national canons, and you will see that that's also the expectation in our local bylaws and in the diocesan canons. I'm going to share those with you. The other thing is there's an importance. I have a second one there, though. A member in good standing is an interesting description. It says, is faithful in working, praying, and giving for the spread of the kingdom. Is what it says there in section 3. So it does describe what the expectations are of a communicant in good standing. Praying, working, praying, giving for the spread of the kingdom. Finally, the section 4, and actually there's some additional sections, but they have to do with the recording of membership. The Episcopal Church is fairly strict. I'm not sure that that's the right word, but we try to keep track of our people. We try. And it's a challenge because we have this large book, which is the church register, which in theory puts in those who were baptized, those who were confirmed, and it records the membership of the church. I think we're getting a little bit more sophisticated, but you'd be surprised how challenging the book is. But that's the clergy's responsibility. That's one of the jobs of the clergy. Let me move forward here. There's also some rules about excommunication or refusal of communion. And there's some things in there that are you may want to read at some point. But one of the things I think is important is baptism is required to receive Holy Communion. There's a lot of controversy about this particular thing because there's some people who say, wait a minute, if you feel that God is calling you and you want to receive communion, you're welcome to do it. Some people will say that. But if we follow the rules precisely, no unbaptized person shall be eligible to receive Holy Communion in this church. That's a challenge, and it's being discussed a lot in churches because some people feel that everyone should be welcome. If you feel that God is moving in your life, and even though you're not baptized, you feel that God's presence is there in the sacrament of Holy Communion, that you should be able to be a part of that body. But again, that's part of the ongoing development of the church. As I said, some years ago, you couldn't receive communion unless you were confirmed. I know when I grew up, that's the way it was. That when I was 12, I went to confirmation, and then I could finally receive communion. So it's a moving target. But what I wanted to share with you tonight is just simply what the rules are at the moment. Okay. These are interesting things about parishes and so forth, but also in the Constitution and Canons, it talks a little bit about parish vestries. And interesting, it says in every parish, the number, mode, selection, term of office of wardens and members of vestry with the qualifications of voters shall be such as state or diocesan law requires, may permit, and the wardens and members of the vestry selected under such law shall hold office until their successors are selected and qualified. Effectively, what it sort of passes the buck is, hey, the vestry has to operate within the context of the laws of the state. And where this is a little tricky is with, for instance, a confirmed adult communicant who's 16 years old. Is that person allowed to be on the board of an institution in the state of Pennsylvania or in any state? Because to some degree there are legal things that a vestry must do. And they have to be done, the legal things need to be done in accordance with the state laws. And if the state law said that they have to be of age, 18 or 21, whatever it happens to be, then even though a person is 16 and eligible, the fact is they probably can't vote on certain matters relating to finance and so forth. Again, these are little sort of nuances that evolve. So, let us move forward. And just to show you a couple of other things, the bylaws of All Saints Church. Our eligibility, the vestry shall consist of members of the church who are confirmed, communicants in good standing of the Episcopal Church. And we talked a little bit about what that meant. The diocese has some other interesting things in it that I'm not sure everybody's familiar with. Again, every person chosen as a member of the vestry of a parish shall qualify by subscribing to the following declaration and promise. I do believe the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be the Word of God and to contain all things necessary to salvation. And I do consent to be governed by the doctrine, discipline, and worship of the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America, and I promise that I will faithfully execute the office of member of vestry according to the best of my ability. And then the second thing says, a vestry shall have not fewer than 3 or more than 12 members, confirmed adult communicants. So they reiterate the adult communicants, but they put in that loyalty oath. I'm not quite sure what it is. And I would love to hear how it got there. But it is part of the canons in the Diocese of East Carolina. So I guess Next January, when we swear in the vestry, we'll have them affirm that. No. This is the Diocese of East Carolina. So every diocese makes their own regulations about. In other words, you saw what the national church said. They're very broad. Hey, just follow what the states allow you to do. Is effectively what the national church says. The diocesan says, hey, this is the rule. And you saw what we said. We said simply a person must be a confirmed member of the church. All right? Moving forward, I thought we'd at least give you the broader picture of the church. And the first breadth of our church is the Diocese of East Carolina. We are a congregation within this church. We're one of the 67 parishes that are part of this diocese, and this is our bishop, Reverend Robert Skirving, and he will be here on the, I think, 11th of October at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I believe some of you are going to be confirmed, and that's exciting. And look forward to being there and being a part of that. So that's our next higher level of command. The next higher level after that is the Episcopal Church in the United States of America. We welcome all who worship Jesus Christ. We have 111 dioceses in the Episcopal Church and regional areas in 17 countries. For instance, we're in Cuba. There's a lot of countries, and we look to some degree like a worldwide church, even though we aren't, but we are, and it's kind of a funny thing. Mission of the church is to restore all people, and these are some various understandings. But for the Episcopal Church, the Jesus movement calls us to focus on three priorities: evangelism, reconciliation, and care of the creation. So that's the Episcopal Church in the USA. And the boss there is Michael Bruce Curry. And I think many of you have either heard him or heard of him. He used to be the Bishop of North Carolina before he was selected to be our presiding bishop. And he's a phenomenally gifted preacher and a phenomenally gifted human being. And we are more than fortunate to have elected him to be our bishop. And there's some information about him. But he's a terrific guy, and he gave our stewardship speech once, 2 years ago, I think. So, Michael Curry. There's also beyond that, beyond the Episcopal, is the Anglican Communion. And the Anglican Communion is one of the largest Christian communities. But what's interesting about it is, in the last paragraph, there is no central authority in the Anglican Communion. Even though, and on the next slide, you will see the Archbishop of Canterbury. He's sort of the titular head, but he's got, he can't say anything. He can say whatever he wants, and he actually manages some of these four instruments. He, of course, is the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Lambeth Conference, which is where all the bishops get together. They were supposed to get together this year. They actually were not able to, but next year they will get together. And there's a fair amount of controversy in that because, for instance, one of the issues around the Anglican Communion is the ordination of women to be bishops. And of course, the long-standing issue of LGBT people elected bishops. And so there's a lot of controversy floating around in the Anglican Communion. And of course, one of them is here in the United States. When the Bishop of New Hampshire, now I can't think of his name, Robinson was elected bishop, a gay person. A lot of people felt that was wrong and was no longer appropriate and left the Episcopal Church. Now, what they didn't want to do was they didn't want to leave the Anglican Communion. And so they formed dioceses and other things. And what they did was they began to relate to dioceses in Africa. And they sort of thought that they could get into the Anglican Communion through other means. Unfortunately, it's been very controversial and very difficult in many ways. And really since, I think it was 2003, it's been very controversial in the Episcopal Church. The Diocese of Virginia had a lot of challenges in that regard. And the Diocese of South Carolina, they're still fighting the problem big time in terms of it's been in courts and then it's been out of courts because the people who left, the ones who decided they didn't want to go to Africa, they wanted to remain within the church. But the Anglican Communion, the relationship that the Anglican Communion has with its various provinces is that they are all national bodies. Now, in the Lutheran Church, there's a lot of different kinds of Lutherans. And so, for instance, here on the Outer Banks, the church that meets in our facility is an evangelical Lutheran church. Down the road, there's another Lutheran church that's a Missouri Synod Lutheran church. They don't get along too well, but they're considered Lutherans. They're still part of the Lutheran denomination. People who split from the Episcopal Church, they may call themselves Anglicans, but they are not recognized by Lambeth. In other words, their bishop is not invited to the Lambeth Conference. They, to some degree, are like Congregationalists, only they're diocesanalists, or I'm not sure what you would call them. But they've chosen to operate independently. So anyway, those are the instruments of the Anglican Communion: Lambeth Conference, primates meetings, and then there's an ongoing body called the Anglican Consultative Council, in which there's bishops, a lot of people, and they're talking all the time. So I think more than anything, what this provides is a network of people who are talking about the issues of Christianity in the world, and I think that's important.
David, I've totally forgotten who the primates are. The primate council. I keep thinking
I think the primates are like Michael Curry is a primate. In other words, the leader of that particular country's bishops.
that's still a big group if there's 160-some countries.
Yes, that's a big group, but it's a huge group when all the bishops get together, which is the Lambeth Conference. I wanted to show a video, but the video didn't work. But it relates to the evolution of the Anglican Communion. Originally, it was obviously just in England, but it spread out all over the world, and including the United States. And it's really one of the larger denominations in the world, and we are a part of that. And just so we know who our titular head is, the Archbishop of Canterbury. He's kind of the focus of the unity, and he's the leader of the Anglican Communion. And there he is. And if you watch the National Cathedral on Sunday, which I encourage you to do, they have a great service, and the music's phenomenal. Maybe not as good as ours, but it's good. But Justin Welby preached on Sunday, and he's a terrific guy, and a very interesting guy. He was a business person, was involved in the oil business, but he changed his stripes, and he is the Archbishop of Canterbury. Having said that was a lot of words, but hopefully they were somewhat coherent. And do you have any questions? Yes.
So we want to become adult members
Uh-huh.
of this church. I was previously a Southern Baptist, baptized by immersion.
Uh-huh.
I can remember it quite well.
Right.
And I'm not sure because whether am I being confirmed or received?
You will be confirmed because you were baptized, but generally the Baptists and those congregations do not. In other words, there's not a higher level of membership. If you're baptized, you're in, and so we require for if people are baptized would like to move to the next level, you are then confirmed. People who are Roman Catholics who decide they want to become Episcopalians are received into the Episcopal Church. In other words, if you have already received the laying on of hands of a bishop, you are then received into, and the Orthodox people that might happen too, and so forth. But that's how that works. Good question. I appreciate your comment. That's a good one. Other questions?
You know what I have found intriguing is I've only been in 2 dioceses, so that's part of it. I have not experienced in either one an adherence to that policy of a person has to be baptized to receive communion.
Yeah.
So I guess it's impressive. I don't know. I'm sure every diocese has got some variations, or some dioceses that may be a very big deal. But it's also interesting to me that it does not seem to be in some places an issue at all.
It's